Guys, it's the fall season, and you know what that means. It's to wrap up the conclusion of the show car season. Lots of people are now getting ready to sell their cars because they want to try something new for the next year or move on to a completely different realm of car enthusiasm. Others are just kind of done with the game and want to get out. But that leaves us with a very, very particular question. What project to buy? Well, in a world full of stereotypes, it's very easy to fall into a stereotypical trap, being a 240, an RX-7, Supra, GTR, something like that. But there's a lot of underrated, underappreciated cars out there that would make for great projects. And if you followed this series at all, that being the Unexpected series, you know that that's entirely our focus, is vehicles that normally would not be considered good project cars. But today, we're going to take a look at 4 quality track toys that you could buy for relatively cheap and take straight to the track. Now before we dive in, I do want to give us one major caveat. When we say track toy, we mean something that you could cheaply build, take to a autocross or to some form of HPD, something like that. Not necessarily something to compete with Porsches per se, but say your local Miata group, or even just getting out there and going fast on the street if that's your particular flavor. We're not going to limit the term track toy to any one particular form of motorsport, but we are going to pull out some very specific examples of ones that would do well in maybe a couple of different types of motorsport. With that said, let's move on to our very first option on this list, the Chevy Cobalt SS. Now, when you think of a tuner car, let's be honest, you're thinking of Paul Walker's Eclipse. You're thinking of the Honda Civics down the way, Evos, other Japanese sports cars. You're not necessarily thinking of a Chevy Cobalt, let alone anything American for that matter. While most people will automatically just go for the Japanese tuning cars like Miatas and Civics for some kind of autocross or, you know, mild enthusiast track day, the Chevy Cobalt really should not be slept on, especially its SS variant. The SS variant is a turbocharged 4-cylinder with a manual transmission, and that's the only way they came. If that doesn't scream an enthusiast car, I don't really know what else will. It makes a quite respectable 260 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque out of its turbocharged engine, and you can pretty much find parts for it in any given AutoZone or Advanced Auto Parts or wherever your local parts store is. You'll most likely find what you need there to fix it. They're relatively cheap, with most people not wanting more than about $4,000 to $5,000 for the ones they've got, and finding an unmodified one might be a challenge, but it's pretty easy to undo most of people's mistakes, just because it's not a lot you can do, but what you can do can be very helpful. These little zippy sedans can go pretty fast, and with a 5.70 to 60 time, it might not be the quickest off the line, but if you know how to drive a car that really relies on momentum, like a Civic, you'll be right at home in this car. And keeping in line with the unexpected tuner cars, the Dodge SRT4 Neon. If you know your engines and know your Fast and Furious knowledge, you'll know that Paul Walker did not in fact drive a GSX in the first Fast and Furious, but in fact was an Eclipse RS. Now, while that car easily could have its own place on this list, we figured we would go with a car that has maybe a little less knowledge about it, and that being the Dodge SRT4 Neon, because they share the same engine. While it's true that the SRT4 didn't exactly have the same bore size, being a 2.4 versus the RS's 2-liter, it had a lot of the same parts and had a lot of the same suspension components and behaved relatively similarly. And as time moved on, when we got to the SRT4 versions of it, it was much faster than you expected. There have been several examples of people getting their feelings hurt by these little tiny Dodges that really have no business existing within the Dodge lineup because it just does not fit in. I mean, let's be honest, this car looks like a fish. Like, this does not look like it belongs on a drag strip hurting feelings. This looks like it belongs in the Baltimore Aquarium with children going like this on the glass looking at it. While yes, it's true that finding parts is a little bit harder than other cars just because of the whole DSM thing not being a thing anymore, these are still very solid options to take on track, especially considering how nimble they actually can be. In fact, a lot of the specs and numbers for this car are very similar to the Chevy Cobalt SS, being that it has about 215 horsepower, but 245 pound-feet of torque, and just a slight bit lighter than your average SS chassis weight. But unlike the SS, this does have a lot more mod support. In fact, you can buy engines from, MA Performance. That's not something to shake a fist at, especially considering that this little tiny peppy car from back in the day was really Dodge's way of trying to eke in onto the success of things like Civics from back in the day. Unfortunately, prices for these can be a little all over the map, but they are still solid options. If you can find one that's in relatively good rust-free shape, turn that thing into a beast. It deserves it. Next up on our list is a car that is highly unappreciated and very easily looked over because of the fact that it's just a strange looking car. But if you can look past all that, you'll find that this car is quite a lovable little man, and that is the final edition of the Toyota Celica. See, most people, when they think Toyota, they immediately put their minds towards the Supra. Rightfully so. It's a powerful car, it makes a lot of power, and looks good. Got the 2JZ, and it's not something to shake a fist at. But what if you're not trying to be in that class of car at the track? What if you want something that's a little more approachable? Something that's not gonna necessarily cost you a fortune just to buy it? Well, the Celica GTS is gonna be your way to go. You see, these little boxy, weird, anime-ish looking cars came with a nice, lovely little secret. The engine that was inside is the same engine that went into a Lotus Elise. You see, in the GTS model, at its heart, is a 2ZZGE motor. It's an engine built in partnership with Yamaha, and if you know anything about good old Toyota, they like to work a lot with them. The 2J, the 3SGE, the 4AGE, even the 1J, those were all Yamaha partnership built engines with Toyota. These are not things that you shake fists at. No, these are mostly respected engines, and with good reason. They're great motorsports engines. So why do people sleep on this car? Is it the fact that it was, shall we say, riced into oblivion? Most likely. They're cars that unfortunately had a very cheap price tag to get into, and as a result, shall we say, cheap people got into them instead. But if you can find one and save it from its unfortunate clutches of a ricer, you're in for a good time. They can be tuned to perform quite excellently for autocross and for any of your lower horsepower racing. And if you have a clever tuner who knows how to manipulate VVT and maybe try to put some ITBs on there, well, you're in for a really, really fun time. As is, they're the engine that was in the MR2. So why not give it a shot? And finally, the last car on this list is one that, if you know your Subaru history, this is a weird one. The Saab 92X Aero. Affectionately known as the Saabaroo, this was a really odd car just all the way around. I mean, if you look at the body, it's immediately apparent that this is in fact a WRX with a Saab facelift. In fact, it's also a WRX engine. Whose car is this really? Ironically, Chevy's. More accurately, it should be said that General Motors is actually the people who helped bring that Saabaroo to the States, because they held a 100% equity share of the company at the time. And this was also Saab's way of trying to cut into some of that lovely, juicy DC5 Honda money. They wanted something that could compete against some of the tuner cars of the early thousands, and this was their way of doing it. So, if you want a Subaru, a WRX wagon to be more specific, but you don't want to spend Subaru money, this is it. Because everything about it is identical to the Subaru except for the fact that it has a Saab badge. Literally, look at interior pictures, look at the exterior, it's even the same EJ motor underneath. It's a Subaru with a Saab body kit sold by GM. The weirdest car on this list by far, one with the most interesting story. If you ever want to look that up, let us know down below. But yeah, you could probably find these for relatively cheap, because most people who bought a Saab are not, shall we say, tuners. In fact, most people who bought a Saab are most likely dentists or James May. I don't know, you decide. With that said, thank you guys for checking out this list. There are a few other honorable mentions, such as the Focus SVT, but these I felt like were really, really solid examples because obviously the Ford Focus later on became a highly desirable tuner car. Just not that model from the early thousands that the Escort was pretty much built off of. Like I said, honorable mention right here in the end credits section. But what do you guys think? Have you owned any of these cars? Did you even know that these cars existed or were even capable of being solid track toys? Let us know down in that comment section, because as is, I do try to read all of them, and more importantly, it is a lot of fun to have discussions down there about some of these topics. So, without further ado, thank you all for watching. God bless you guys, and we'll see you on another episode. Peace.